The United States government created a bank specifically for freed slaves. Then the men running it quietly looted every dollar and handed a black man the keys right before it exploded. Here is exactly how they did it. There's a formula buried inside American financial history. It has 5 steps, and those steps have never changed. Build an institution for people who have no other place to turn. Earn their trust, then quietly rewrite the rules behind their backs. Drain the money, and when it all falls apart, point the finger at someone else. On March 3, 1865, Congress built a bank for people who had just been freed from bondage. By 1870, white trustees had secretly altered its legal foundation. By 1873, they had funneled depositors' money into their own ventures. By 1874, they needed someone to absorb the blame, so they chose Frederick Douglass. He walked through the front door as president. He lasted barely 6 weeks. The Freedmen's Savings and Trust Company was chartered by Congress and signed into law by Abraham Lincoln, the same day as the Freedmen's Bureau and all its sweeping guarantees. The purpose was straightforward on its surface. 4 million people had just been freed from bondage. Most had never been permitted to possess a single thing. This bank would give them a safe place to put their wages. The original charter came with clear protections. Deposits could only go into stocks, bonds, treasury notes, or other government securities. No loans, no speculation. The money would sit in the most secure instruments the nation had to offer. A board of 50 trustees would watch over everything. It sounded like a promise the government actually intended to keep. But look at the fine print, and the fault lines were already there. All 50 original trustees were white. Not one was required to post any personal bond guaranteeing their honest management. The charter included no penalties for mismanagement, no personal liability for trustees who let the money vanish, no mechanism for depositors to hold a single person accountable. Abraham Lincoln signed that charter. 5 weeks later, he was dead, and the bank he had created was already hollow in ways nobody had yet recognized. But freed people trusted it. Why would they not? The bank's own advertisements displayed images of Lincoln, Ulysses Grant, and William Sherman, official-looking, government-adjacent, or so it appeared. The passbook handed to every depositor told them they were part of a benevolent institution. The bank's newspaper declared that this was the place for them because it was run entirely by their greatest allies. For people with nowhere else to go, people who had been legally barred from owning anything just months before, that language landed hard. It felt like the government was finally delivering on its promises. It felt like freedom was becoming something tangible. So they deposited, week after week, dollar by dollar, sacrificing present comfort for a future they had only just been permitted to imagine. The numbers show how completely they believed. Within 7 years, 37 branches opened across 17 states and Washington, D.C. More than 70,000 people opened accounts. Total deposits over the bank's lifetime exceeded $57 million, roughly $1.5 billion in today's money. Most individual accounts held somewhere between $5 and $50. $5, that was a full week's wages for many of these depositors, former slaves saving every spare cent from their first free paychecks, black soldiers depositing military earnings, churches and mutual aid societies pooling their resources. Dollar by dollar, 57 million accumulated. In 1870, in Richmond, Virginia, a man named Robert Harris walked into the Freedmen's Bank with his wife Betsy and their 2 children. Charles was 6, Mary Susan was 11. Robert had been enslaved 5 years before. He could not have opened a bank account if he had wanted to, because legally he had not existed. Now he was opening accounts for his children. When he sat down with the cashier, he gave his full name, his birthplace, his occupation, his address. He listed his wife, his children, his parents, his siblings. For the first time in his life, his family appeared in an official document, not as property, but as human beings with savings. The bank required this information from every depositor: full name, place of birth, current residence, occupation, names of spouses, children, parents, siblings. For formerly enslaved depositors, sometimes the names of former owners and the plantations where they had been held. Records from 29 branches survive today. They contain approximately 480,000 personal names. This is the largest single collection of lineage-linked African American records known to exist. Before 1865, enslaved people could not file marriage certificates or hold land titles. They were not listed by name in federal censuses. These registers are often the first time these individuals appear in any official document at all. Remember that. It becomes important later. Now let me tell you about May 2nd, 1870. If you want to identify the exact date the money started disappearing, that is it. On that day, Congress amended the bank's charter. The original rules sent deposits into government securities, safe, untouchable. The new rule permitted half the money to be loaned out for real estate investments. The man who lobbied Congress for that amendment was Henry D. Cook. He chaired the bank's finance committee. He was also the brother of J. Cook, founder of J. Cook and Company, the most powerful investment bank in the country. Henry Cook simultaneously served as the territorial governor of Washington, D.C., appointed by his close friend Ulysses Grant. He was president of First National Bank in Washington, which was essentially J. Cook's local office. He sat on the board of the Seneca Sandstone Company. He was positioned on every side of every transaction that followed. He was the bank's guardian and its predator at once. And Congress approved the amendment without adding a single dollar of new oversight.
Someone might ask, banks fail. The panic of 1873 destroyed thousands of businesses. Why treat this differently? Because this was not a market failure. The original charter made catastrophic loss nearly impossible. Money held in government securities does not evaporate in a financial panic. Someone had to rewrite the rules to make the deposits accessible. Someone had to move them from safe instruments into speculative ones. Someone had to loan them to himself. That is not a bank failure. That is something else entirely. Follow the money. Henry Cook deposited up to $500,000 of Freedmen's Bank cash at First National Bank, his brother's operation. The Cook brothers paid 5% interest on those funds. The Freedmen's Bank had promised depositors 6%. That 1% gap came directly out of depositors' savings. $50,000 went to J. Cook and Company for the Northern Pacific Railroad, secured by worthless bonds. Another $50,000 went to the Seneca Sandstone Company, the one Henry Cook had organized and whose board he sat on. $224,000 went to the contractor building the bank's lavish new headquarters, a $260,000 brownstone on Pennsylvania Avenue, paid for entirely with depositors' money. Bank officials approved personal loans to themselves and their associates. And here is the detail that should stop you cold. The few black depositors who actually tried to borrow from their own bank faced far stricter collateral requirements than the white men quietly draining it from the inside. By 1873, roughly 75% of all loans were past due. The vault was nearly empty. The books were fiction. Then came September 18, 1873. J. Cook and Company declared bankruptcy. The Northern Pacific Railroad could not repay what it owed. The panic of 1873 swept across the country. Henry Cook had already resigned as governor 8 days earlier, on September 10th. He had seen it coming. The Freedmen's Bank was among the first institutions to go under. Historian Richard White put it plainly, some of the first people to lose everything in that crash were freed slaves from the Civil War, and they lost it because of J. Cook and Henry Cook and their corrupt arrangement. March 1874. The white trustees knew the bank was dead. They had watched the numbers crater for months. Their solution was not to confess. It was not to return the money. It was not to warn the depositors still standing in line at 37 branches across the country. It was to resign and install Frederick Douglass as president. Think carefully about what that means. The most recognizable black man in America, a former slave who had taught himself to read, an abolitionist whose name carried more moral weight than perhaps anyone alive, a man who had spent his entire life fighting for black freedom. They put his name on a bank they had already killed, so that when it collapsed, his face would be the one depositors remembered. Not Henry Cook's, not Jay Cook's, Frederick Douglass. Douglass did not know. He walked into the magnificent brownstone headquarters on Lafayette Square, directly across from the Treasury and near the White House. He described the building's towering presence and polished interior. He wrote that it made him feel awestruck at its grandeur. He invested $10,000 of his own money. Then he opened the books. He found what he later called a corpse. Far more in outstanding loans than in deposits, debts that would never be repaid, less than $50,000 in actual cash, $400 in bonds. He told Congress to shut it down. I need to stop here because there is a version of this story that is simple. White men stole black money. That is true. But what I cannot stop thinking about is the records. 480,000 names. The first time most of these individuals had ever appeared in an official document. Names of mothers and fathers separated by slavery, listed together for the first time. Names of children born free, recorded alongside the plantations where their parents had been held. The most detailed genealogical record of post-emancipation black life ever assembled, created because the bank needed to identify depositors' heirs in the event of death. The institution that stole the money preserved the names. The same crime that destroyed their savings left behind the most comprehensive archive of who they were. And the people whose names filled those records never received their money back. June 29, 1874. The bank closed. 61,144 depositors had approximately $2.9 million in their accounts. The bank held less than $50,000 in cash, $3.5 million in outstanding loans that would never be recovered. A secret loan of $33,366 was approved the day after the bank formally closed by actuary George Stickney, without legal authority, without notifying the trustees, without consequence. Congress investigated. It recommended indictments for Henry Cook and others. Not a single white trustee was ever charged. Between 1882 and 1920, bill after bill was introduced in Congress to repay depositors with federal funds. Several presidents expressed support. Every single bill was blocked by white Southerners in Congress. Every one. In 1927, the Treasury announced that remaining assets were exhausted. No further payments available. Case closed. In 1939, 65 years after the bank collapsed, a man named Henry Thomas was still writing letters. He begged the NAACP to lobby Congress for the 38% his family had never received. Douglass spent the remainder of his life carrying the blame. He later described the experience as the one connection in his life that had brought him more criticism and attack than anything else he had ever done. He called the bank the black man's cow, but the white man's milk. In 1903, W.E.B. Du Bois wrote that the collapse had done more harm than 10 additional years of slavery could have inflicted, not just to savings, to faith. Faith in institutions, faith in the idea that freedom meant something real, faith in the possibility of building something that could not simply be taken away. The depositors lost more than money. They lost the first concrete proof that their labor held value in a free economy. They lost evidence of their own discipline, their own sacrifice, their own belief that tomorrow could be better than today. And the nation that had chartered the bank shrugged and moved on.
Maybe I am connecting things that have no real connection.
Maybe the Freedmen's Bank was just another casualty of an unstable economy. Maybe the Charter Amendment was simply poor policy, not calculated theft. Maybe installing Douglas was genuine desperation, not deliberate misdirection. Maybe 40 years of blocked reimbursement bills were just ordinary politics. But when the man who rewrote the charter is the same man who received the loans, coincidence stops being persuasive. When an investigation recommends indictments and no one is ever charged, something has gone wrong at a fundamental level. When every attempt at justice is obstructed for 4 decades, I stop reaching for innocent explanations. The pattern repeats with unsettling regularity. Today, the FDIC estimates that Black Americans are unbanked or underbanked at roughly 3 times the rate of white Americans. Financial researchers call it a trust gap. They study it as though it materialized from nothing. It did not materialize from nothing. It took shape on June 29, 1874, when 61,000 people learned that the government's promise was not worth the paper their passbooks were printed on. The Freedmen's Bank building stood on Pennsylvania Avenue, directly across from the Treasury and near the White House, the most prominent financial address in Washington. It was demolished in 1899. The Washington Post ran the headline, "Monument of a Crime." In 2016, the Treasury renamed the building on that site in honor of the Freedmen's Bank. A plaque on the corner. That is what $57 million, $1.5 billion today, purchases you 150 years later. A plaque. But inside the National Archives, the records survive. 480,000 names, written down by people who had never been counted before emancipation. Names of mothers and fathers separated by slavery, appearing together for the first time. Names of children born free, recorded next to the plantations where their parents had been held. Those records were not created out of compassion. They were a bureaucratic requirement of a doomed institution, but they survived, and the money did not. $57 million, 61,000 depositors, 0 prosecutions, 480,000 names in an archive. The evidence exists, the records are open. The only question is whether we are willing to follow where they lead, or whether 150 years later we are still doing exactly what the trustees did, taking the deposits and walking away.